Hi, Latrenda Knighten, Elementary Mathematics Instructional Specialist here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to 5 practices plus 8 effective mathematics teaching practices is a winning combination. So in this presentation, I'm going to share with you 2 of my favorite resources to use as a mathematics educator to promote student learning, to promote student discourse, and to make sure that as an educator that I am aligning my instruction with research aligned practices as well as standards based practices. So a lot of you know me and you've heard me talk about both of these things a lot. So just to give you a little background, 5 practices refers to the 5 practices that are highlighted in this resource. 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematics discussions. That's that discourse piece. And when we talk about those 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, I'm talking about those 8 practices that are highlighted in Principles to Actions in NCTM resource. And so, one of the reasons that I like to call this a winning combination is when I was still a classroom teacher, I received the 5 practices book as a gift. And I began to look at this, and this is actually the first year that we had the compass evaluation in East Baton Rouge Parish, in, well, Louisiana in general. And so when I began to apply the 5 practices to my math instruction, one of the things I noticed is that I was able to get all of the indicators or the check marks that I needed on my compass evaluation so that, we're all competitive. I wanted to get 4, so that's what I was aiming for. And so that was a win for me, but it was more importantly a win for my students because my students were engaged actively in mathematics. They were talking about the work that they were doing. And as a result, they were learning. And so, when combined with those 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, that keeps me grounded as an educator to make sure that I am using those best practices that I know are going to result in student growth and student understanding as they learn mathematics. In today's presentation, you're going to experience a recording of this particular workshop as I did it for an NCTM conference. And so one of the benefits is because it was a live recording, you get to actually hear and experience the comments from participants that were entered in the chat box and for some of the discussions, so that as you look at student work and as you look at the task, you get to hear what other teachers, such as yourself, are thinking about those materials as well. So, as we get ready to get started, I want you to think about, the 5 practices, think about the 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, and watch how we unpack both of those resources and watch how we use student work and student samples to show how we can learn some things about student understanding as we look at those things together. For today, one of the things that we're going to look at is we're going to examine research aligned strategies to facilitate mathematical discourse and promote student growth in mathematical reasoning. We will explore the 5 practices for promoting productive classroom discussions, and we'll make connections between the 5 practices and the effective mathematics teaching practices. So if you will, in the chat box, just indicate with a 1 to 5 how familiar you are with the 5 practices. That will give me a little bit of information about who you are and the people who are here with me this evening. So as you guys share your information about the 5 practices, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and my journey to this discovery. So those of you who are familiar with this resource, you know that the first edition of this book was released in 2011. And so in 2011, I was still a classroom teacher, and my state had just adopted Common Core standards, and we also had just adopted a new teacher evaluation instrument. And as you can expect, there was just a lot of uncertainty. And so I was very fortunate that I received this book as a gift. And so as I looked at it, I was like, everything here makes perfect sense. These are things that are going to help my students to learn and help my students to demonstrate their understanding. But at the same time, one of the positive effects is that I found that I was hitting all of those indicators on our state's teacher evaluation program. So I was like, wow, I'm getting high marks and my students are doing well. So it's a win-win situation all around. And so to be completely honest, even though it's about math, I found that a lot of those things carried over into other content areas as well. So if, Beth, are there any things in the chat box? Any people have indicated 1 to 5?
Oh, everything from 0 to 5. Lots of sort of middle of the ground 2s and 3s, but everything. Even, yeah.
So great. So that means I have a nice, diverse group of people here. So that means I have some people who can help me out, and you also are cheerleaders, and I have some people who might be newbies. So let's take a look at what those 5 practices are. So the first is setting goals and selecting tasks. The second one is anticipating likely student responses. So this is that planning piece. This is the most important part when you think about what students may respond to when you present them with a task. Monitoring students' actual responses, that's where we put on our ears and we put our big eyes on, and so we're watching and we're listening to see what students are doing. Selecting particular students to present their mathematical work during the whole class discussion. So being very purposeful about which students are going to present that work, because we sequence it so that it tells a story. And in telling that story, we make connections between the student responses and also to the mathematical ideas that we're putting forth in the lesson. So some of you are probably looking on the screen and you're noticing there are more than 5 practices listed on this screen, because actually there are 6. So those of you who are familiar with this resource, you've seen the story written by the authors where Peg Smith mentioned that they know that there's a practice 0, because it all starts with setting those goals and selecting the tasks that you're going to use with students. But by then, everyone knew 5 practices, so they weren't going to go back, get the books out, put a slash through the 5 and put a 6. So we know that the title of the protocol is 5 practices, but there are actually 6. So setting goals and selecting tasks is what we like to refer to as practice 0. So this graphic just reminds us how looking at the 5 pieces that take place after you select the task and you set goals, how they are related to each other, how they are codependent on each other, if you want to think of it that way. Because that planning that I do in the anticipating piece, that's going to determine what I'm going to do when I'm monitoring my students, when I'm walking around and I'm finding out what are they doing, I'm asking probing questions and things of that nature. And so you see how each piece builds on the other and how they're connected so that they help you to build that rich discourse experience in your classroom. So now we come to another part of my journey. So now it's 2014. And so in 2014, NCTM released Principles to Actions. And so when Principles to Actions was released, we were all introduced to those 8 effective mathematics teaching practices. And so many of you were probably like me, veteran teachers. And so these are not earth-shattering announcements, but when you look at this, these are 8 very practical, research-aligned practices that if I'm using these in my math classroom, I'm sure to make sure that my students are learning, they're growing, they're engaged in problem solving, problem posing, and they go very well with the 5 practices. So these are 2 of my favorite resources that I like to use for teaching students. And so now, in the role that I am in now, where I work with teachers and I support them, these are 2 of the things that I usually go in first thing and share with them these resources and how they can use this to enrich discourse in their classroom and to change those practices in their classroom to make sure that their students are the thinkers and the student has the voice in the classroom. And so today's presentation was listed as pre-K2. And so those of you who know that these things span K-12, but because the task that we'll look at in the student work is a first grade task, that's why it is advertised for pre-K2. So you can apply these principles to the grade levels that you work with, or if you support teachers for multiple grades, you definitely can use it to support them as well. So now that you've gotten a little bit of my story, we're going to dive right in. So we're going to start with practice 0, setting goals and selecting tasks. So there are a couple of things you have to consider when you think about doing that. So you have to think about, does the goal focus on what students will learn about mathematics as opposed to what they will do? When you select the task, does it provide students with the opportunity to think, reason, and problem solve? What are the resources that you're going to provide to ensure that all students can access the task? And keep in mind, when we think about those 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, one of the things we want to think about is having that entry level for all students. So making it accessible. And what will you take as evidence that students have met the goal through their work on this task? So with that said, we want to look at a task. And so this is a task that is in the companion to the 5 practices. The 5 practices in practice, successfully orchestrating mathematics discourse. And so this is from the elementary version of the book. And so this task is a teacher who is featured in that book actually created it to use with our first grade students. So I want you to take some time and I want you to look at this task about Miss Tyus and her markers. And I want you to think about, what are some things that students should know and be able to do to be successful on this task. And please use the chat box to document your thinking. This would be given to first grade students, second semester, and possibly second graders at the beginning of the school year, just to give you a context for where this would fit if this is not your grade band. Okay, have some things to share with me, Belle?
Oh my goodness, amazing things. So place value, friendly numbers, counting on, counting back, equations, things about the vocabulary in there, reading comprehension, problem solving, understanding difference. I think I saw number lines, double-digit equations, making sense of it, 10 frames, place value, lots of really rich ideas here.
Those are great. I saw here some references to different representations that you expect to see students exemplify in this task. And so this is one of the pieces, I know I'm preaching to the choir by saying this to you guys, is that planning piece. It's one of the most important things that we can do as teachers in our classroom, is to put forth those things at the beginning before we put things forth for our students. So now that you've had a chance to think about what students should know and be able to do, I just want to share with you some of the ideas that the teacher brainstormed that she expected to see from her students based on the work that they had done prior to this task. Obviously, as some of you mentioned, using multiple representations. So that comes from having a classroom environment where there's flexible thinking. Students are allowed to use multiple strategies and lots of varieties, that students know that they can use multiple representations to solve the same problem, but then thinking about how can we connect those representations to each other. I heard some people said some things about knowing things about two-digit numbers. What are some of the things you need to know about adding or subtracting two-digit numbers? What if a student wanted to use compensation? So one of her expectation is that students would know that decomposing and recomposing numbers in systematic ways can help you to solve problems. So thinking about those strategies that students may use so that you're going into this with a lot of information and several expectations that you can use. So now that brings us to practice one. So this is the part where we really have to think about what are some of those approaches that students may use and think about possible solutions, but it's just as important to think about what are some of the incorrect solutions that students may give. So having a plan for what are those incorrect pieces they may have. So we've already done this part where you guys describe what students should know and be able to do to solve this task. But now I want you to think about the strategies that you might expect to see a first grade student use. Think about where kids may struggle and maybe what could possibly be some of the challenges that students may encounter. And use the chat box to document your thoughts here as well.
So we're getting some really nice things about real world and drawings and manipulatives.
Okay.
Counting on, and using manipulatives. Students might regroup but forget they rounded. Context, base 10 blocks. Concrete to pictorial, manipulatives. Oh, these are coming in so nicely. Regrouping. Hundreds chart. Now they're flying now. Virtual manipulatives, someone put in.
Yes, it is 2020. There's not enough Lysol to share the class manipulatives. You know, there's a shortage.
Let's see, new vocabulary. Students will direct model the action of the story. Students might use compensation, an abacus. Nice.
Great. So you guys are well on your way anticipating. And so this is one of the most important parts because now I'm going into this task with some expectations, but also I like to think that I have some plans because I know that I may not see everything I expect, but I know what we've been working on in class, so I have an idea of what are some things that I might need to do during that monitoring part, maybe to prompt students or move them a little bit further. And this takes us to the next part of, I'm sorry, I was going to let you look at the task as you did that. So, but see, you guys remembered it already. The next part of anticipating is to think about the questions you want to answer. And so this makes us think about posing purposeful questions when we think about effective mathematics teaching practices. And so this is the part that I find that we forget to do sometimes is to actually identify what are those questions that I want to ask students. You know, not did you get the answer? Did you not get the answer? What are those probing questions? So you want to think about two types of questions. Those assessing questions, which are based solely on the work that students have produced, and then those advancing questions. These are those that move students further. And the reason you want to go back and do this piece is because those are those questions that you will use during the monitoring process as you monitor students' work and you watch and you observe what they're doing. So I have a plan. It's like, you know, I've already got something here in my toolbox so that there's a plan for those pieces and those parts that I want to ask students as we move on. So for the sake of time, I know you guys have, I can tell by the body of work that you produce that you would have a wealth of numerous questions to add to these categories, but I want to make sure you get a chance to actually look at the student work. So we're going to move to the next step, which is monitoring. And I have to say that is one of my favorite parts because as students are working, this is where I remind myself to, you know, this is the time for me to be silent and watch very closely what my students are doing, and then actually listen. And so this is a time when I can go, I can ask questions, I can listen, and then I can ask those probing questions. I see that you use, a 10 frame to solve this problem. Can you think of another strategy? Can you tell me how this relates to what you have here? And thinking about all of those pieces there. And some children really appreciate that opportunity when they're having that time to work and that you're having that individual time. So they're not having to respond with the whole group, and like Johnny on the spot, who's always faster than everyone else, is the first person to respond. They have that moment, to actually get their thoughts down, to use whatever tools and resources that they need to use to solve that task. So there are a couple of things that can be helpful. Some people like to have a method for collecting that information, because remember, we're not just doing this so that when the principal walks in your room, she goes, wow, look at that Latrinda. She walks around, she's watching her kids, so she's not sitting behind the desk. There's a reason why I'm monitoring. I'm collecting this information because I'm going to use this to guide the discussion. Some people like to create a chart. And I've done it a couple of times this way, where and I'll show you a sample in a minute, where you create a chart and you list the possible solutions that you've seen students using, but you make note of which students have used that strategy. Now, one of the things I like to do, if I note that maybe 2 people use a base 10 strategy, but I make some notes about maybe how Jaleesa used it as opposed to how Marcus used it. And then once you have that chart that identifies the strategies that students have used and who used those strategies, later you can go back to your monitoring chart and then use that work to decide what order you want your students to present. But sometimes I have to be completely honest. I usually collect my information the old school way. As Beth told you, I'm a little old. So I use the old school way, where you maybe use just anecdotal notes. One of my favorite ways is to have my composition notebook and maybe have Post-its or some type of sticky notes. And I'm just making note of each child's name, what strategies I see them using. I can stick them in that composition book. And so, at the beginning of the year, they're usually about a quarter, so you can buy a lot of them. And so that way, for each module or unit, I've got one book, so I can take that one composition book as I'm going through those notes and use that to make some notes to plan, for the next lesson, for the next day, or for the next activity. And it's small, it's portable. So that's what works for me for collecting that. And so this is an example of a sample monitoring chart, so you have an idea of what that could look like. So now we have selected the task, which I did select the task for you. You had an opportunity to engage in the anticipating. Because we're in a virtual environment, we didn't get a chance to walk around to monitor, but we'll talk about ways that you can do that at the end as well. But I do want you to engage in parts of the last 3 practices. So the selecting, the sequencing, and the connecting. So for the purpose of today, I did select the student work samples for you, but what you'll get an opportunity to do is to examine each of those student pages and then gather some information so that you can actually do that sequencing. So selecting and sequencing is exactly what it is. You're going to decide which student work samples or which students you're going to highlight in that whole class discussion, and you're going to sequence that student work so that it tells a story. Some people like to go from more concrete to more abstract. Some people go from abstract to more concrete. I've seen sometimes you start in the middle, or some people start with an incorrect response and use the class discussion to help a student to build understanding and to find a way to problem solve and to arrive there. You really have to consider the task, consider your students, and consider the situation when you think about how you want to tell that story. And the last piece is making those connections so that students can connect their work to each other and also make sense of it and how it relates to the mathematics. So what you're going to have an opportunity to do is examine some student work samples. So there are a couple of things I'm going to ask you to do first. As you look at each student sample, I want you to think about what you notice, maybe what you wonder about each student's response. Think about if there are any questions that you would want to ask the student, and maybe tell why. So I'm going to switch to the student work. And so the first student work sample you see is for student 8. So for the purposes of this, we just have numbers to number the students. So I'm going to actually close my mouth and stop talking, and I'm going to give you a chance to look at this page. And remember, make notes of things you notice, things maybe you wonder about, and if there are any questions you would ask the student. And I'll set my timer so we can kind of plan our work here. If you could start getting some things entered in the chat box about now, that would be great.
So the trend of people have been starting to put things in. Do you want to hear it yet now, or do you want to give people a little more time? Are you
ready? Give them 30 more seconds.
30 more seconds. Okay.
So some people are still thinking, can still process. Yeah. I think we're doing good so far on time, but thank you.
Sure.
Okay, there's my timer. Let's start hearing some of your thoughts about student 8.
Oh, goodness. Okay, so I actually got a piece of paper out and started writing down their notes.
And I forgot to remind everybody to get a blank Google Doc and start jotting down some of your thoughts.
It's so good. So what's really interesting is their responses are pretty deep. So they're 3 or 4 sentences in some cases. But many of them were saying they would ask them to retell the story or talk about tens and ones. Can you tell me something about tens and ones? And then what strategy did you use? Maybe some questions about how did you get your answer? How can you show me the way? So really more about asking conversation and engaging in conversations about the work, it seems like. But then there's also this other section of comments, Latrina, that's talking about what they're noticing. Like, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I noticed that I'm trying to understand the diagram and some of those really nice comments that we all have when we look at student work.
I'm laughing because I know these kids.
Yes. Oh, so now you're laughing. What does the whole represent in the T diagram? Tell them to act it out with Unifix cubes.
Ooh.
Yeah. Maybe ask them to rewrite the problems in bunk bed style to show work.
So lots of great questions for that monitoring piece. As you're walking around and you're seeing that work. So lots of things. I thought about this kid. I thought about maybe he needed it cut up and here's one and then here's the other or whatever to help organize his thoughts a little bit more possibly. So are we ready to look at another piece of student work? So now we have student number 14. And so I'll use the same amount of time on the timer and give you some time to examine this one. About 30 more seconds. Okay, let's hear what you have to say about student 14.
I love the music there, your timer. So the trend overwhelmingly, they feel like they can understand the students' thinking more, but because there's evidence of place value understanding. And they're also saying they would ask questions about, tell me about your slash marks, tell me what your your drawing means or your sketch means. Also, they feel like they can see the place value understanding here by the way that the student represented it. It looks as if the student has had experience with base 10 materials. So if I could say a word that keeps coming up is so much clearer. So that's kind of the big takeaway of this.
So let's go to one more. Student 10. Thirty more seconds. There's our timer again. Let's find out about student 10.
All right, so a lot of conversation about number lines, counting backwards, decomposing, counting back, skip counting, and then some wonderings or questions about that the equation doesn't match. Maybe they need to get more information. Are there other tools potentially being used as well at this time? Is there some evidence of that? Some concerns about the direction of the number line. Lots of people feel like it's a good strategy, so there's a lot of conversation around that, and the evidence for the student thinking. So, and the questions are things like, tell me more about that. I'm trying to think. With just more questioning about it. Tell me a little bit more about what you're doing.
So lots of opportunities to really extend the students' thinking, and possibly other students who think the same way in the class as well. So we have one more piece of student work to look at, and this is student 18. $30 seconds. And there's our timer. So what are your thoughts on student 18?
Wow. Well, this was very interesting to look at these, because they switched from identifying the concern with the ones, forgetting to add the ones, but then it went to a big conversation of good illustration of base 10 blocks. Maybe the student needs more concrete material. So they're the teachers moving right into what they would do next. So the students using place value to subtract. So they see a lot of things that are correct, but then they're looking for some of the holes and some of the things that they might be able to clarify. Misunderstanding of what to do with the ones. And some people are wondering if it's just neglect or forgetting, not because the setup is correct. So model using place value charts, hand over some place value materials to the base 10 materials to the student. Zero in the ones place is a concern. Just lots of really rich conversation about this.
So thank you so much for engaging in that little excursion. So, one of the things this taught me is, like a student paper is not just a student paper. You have to have so many other pieces and parts to go along with it. So I think you guys just illustrated that. So now that you've examined those 4 pages of student work, I want you to think about what order would you have those students present and why. And you may decide, I selected those 4 pages, but maybe you don't want all 4 of those students to present. So you do have that option in your choice. So we'll take a couple minutes and let you guys think about that and share in the chat box which order would you have them present and why. And if we ask they come in, we can share them.
All right, we're waiting.
That's one of the hardest decisions to make, isn't it, guys?
Elizabeth just said, is this why you told us to take notes?
I know it's 6 o'clock on a Monday. I'm so sorry. I apologize.
All right, so 4 or 1 first, I think, and then we get 3, 2, 1. And then let's see, 2 would be first and then third.
Okay.
And then I got 1, 2, 3. Oh, here's somebody. 4, 2, 1, 3. 2, 1, 3, 4. I feel like I'm doing a probability problem. 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4. The last one for okay. So that would be 4 first. 4, 2, 3, 1. 1, 3, 2. 4, 2, 3, 1. 2, 4, 3, 1. Ah, this is great. Some people are explaining their answers. I would start with the one who did the discs and the 0, then the 2 and the 3.
Okay.
Yeah. We've got a 4, 3, 2, 1. Now people are trying to throw me. T is trying to throw me by putting the student number 18, 10, 14, and 8. Thanks, T.
That's one of those good note-taking kids.
Yes. I'm not surprised. So T3, 2, 3, 4, 1. Ooh, someone suggests I'd compare 2 and 4 side by side and say, what do you notice?
The 2 who used the base 10 modeling.
Yes. Some more 4, 2, 3, 1s, and then start with 3, then have another look and see if they want to edit before sharing. So thinking about rough draft.
So let them revisit their responses.
Yes. Yeah. 2, 3, 2, 4, 3, 1. T's trying to apologize to me. Well, it's okay, T. You're wonderful. I love some of these are. Oh, this chat download is going to be fantastic.
Oh, great! Oh, great!
The thoughtful responses are amazing.
And I hate that we couldn't look at more student work, but in the context of trying to read 20 pages or whatever, you guys would have come to Louisiana and thrown apples and oranges at me or whatever after a long day of being on screen all day having to do that. So you don't have a wide variety of pages to look at.
I love this one, LaTrenda. This is from Lisa. I'll do the 4th one first, but ask, what is brilliant about this one? Need a discussion of using place value. Mistakes should be celebrated. They lead to learning. So really strengths-based approach there. And then a lot of people like the idea of letting them revise and revisit their work before sharing.
I love that. So you're not locked into a response. And if anything else, it teaches us, when kids just answer something in a journal or a notebook and they just put it there and we look at it a week later, I need to put a grade or a number on this, you lose all the richness because you haven't had those conversations with students. They haven't had a chance to see others' responses. They haven't had a chance to make those connections. So taking the time to do this really just enriches the experience for the teacher and the student, I think. So I definitely thank you for taking the time to engage in this piece. So to make sure we end on time, what's that last piece? I want to go back to think about putting the pieces together. So I want to go back and think about the effective mathematics teaching practices. And when we think about those 5 practices, and I think hopefully I don't know if the PDFs that I sent ended up in the chat box or not. I know we had all those tech difficulties. So hopefully you do have those so you can physically look at a copy of those lists. But if we think about establishing math goals to focus learning, and you think about the 5 practices, setting goals and selecting tasks, anticipating, monitoring, selecting, sequencing, and connecting, which of those 5 practices, and you can just put these in the chat box, do you think are closely aligned to establishing math goals to focus learning? We have any thoughts yet?
No, I think they're thinking.
Okay.
Oh, here comes 1, 0.
Okay, so selecting, setting goals, obviously. So that's like a little hint. Setting goals definitely is there. You can have more than one.
People think it's I do too. I think it's a fabulous question, but people are writing, they think it's a great question. Monitoring student work is another popular response.
Okay, you guys want to try one more practice? What about implementing tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving?
Anticipating. All. Setting goals.
Selecting tasks.
Yep. All of them. That's popular. Purposeful questioning.
I'm going to skip to, let's look at number 4, because of course we're talking about discourse. Facilitate meaningful mathematical discourse. When we think about that effective teaching practice, which of the 5 practices are aligned to this effective teaching practice?
So Lisa says 2 to 4.
2 to 4, okay. And then whenever I think about number 4, facilitate meaningful mathematical discourse, I always think about posing purposeful questions.
And so we also have some, there comes purposeful questions, but we have some connecting student solutions and sequencing. And some all of them again.
Exactly. And so, of course, to save time, we won't be able to go through all of them, but it's helpful to think about if these are the practices that I'm going to use as a teacher to make sure that I improve my classroom practice, that I enrich mathematics learning for students. And then I use the 5 practices as my vehicle to build that rich discussion in my classroom, and I put those 2 together, that is a win-win situation, because I'm doing what's good and right for me and my students, but I'm really enriching that experience, not really just for the kids. Just think how much we learn. Just you guys unpacking that student work, just the things that we find out about our kids just when they're given an opportunity to engage in those pieces. So I want to share a couple of things with you. As you guys know, I'm from Louisiana. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this one. This is just one way of how they're aligned or whatever. So it's not that it's the definitive answer, but this is just one way of how they're aligned, where you see in blue are the effective teaching practices and in white are the 5 practices. And so this is just one way they could possibly be aligned. And so as a lot of you said, 1 through 5 of the 5 practices show up pretty often and pretty are utilized and aligned very well to a lot of the effective teaching practices. So just a lot of opportunities, just if the students have the voice in the classroom and the students are being able to talk, to really make sure that. Wow, thank you for still being here with me on this journey. Wasn't it great to look at those student samples and look at the student work and really to have a very specific, very focused protocol for examining student work and thinking about the questions and the discussions that you want to have with students based on the work that they're producing. So I hope you have enjoyed your introduction to the five practices, or maybe it was even a revisiting for some of you, and actually thinking about how using that protocol aligns so well with those research aligned strategies from the 8 effective mathematics teaching practices. So, what would be our next steps? Well, obviously, to think about what are tasks that I can use in my classroom so that I can put this process into motion. And so I want you to think about not thinking that I need to have something new, something extra to add to my repertoire. Look at your application problems that we use daily in our classroom for Eureka Math. These lend themselves very well as tools to use for the five practices. Also, some of the problem posing and tasks that we present to our students as part of concept development. This is a way to move away from a script and make it your own and think about what students need, what you need, and how you can unpack what students are doing. And then one of the most important pieces, you may be thinking, okay, I've got this student work, but Latrinda, we're not really doing a lot of paper tools right now, just, because of social distancing and being very cognizant of trying to minimize the amount of touches of things in the classroom. We are very fortunate in our district that we have the benefit of using tools such as Nearpod. Nearpod was built just for these types of things. You can upload a PDF of the application problem or a task for your students. You can put it in there, and then your students are actually responding to that work via their individual response. You actually are monitoring as you look at the work that they submit and you see their samples, you see their examples, you're providing feedback to them. And at the same time, you can select that student work because you don't have to show their names, and you can randomly select the work or very strategically choose which student work samples you're going to share and do that selecting and do that sequencing and help students to make those connections. So thinking about using the tools that we have before us, that we can still use this process and use this protocol in our classrooms to facilitate student discussion and student discourse, but at the same time, make sure that we're using effective teaching practices to do these things as well. So, as you think about these tools and how we would use them in the classroom, I want you to think about how can you bring that experience to your students so that we really can enrich their mathematics learning. So, I definitely want to thank you for participating and engaging in this presentation, but also keep in mind that if you have some more questions or you want some support with implementing this process in your classroom, please reach out to me. Please email. Those of you who know me, you know that I love visiting classrooms. I love participating. And so let's do this together. Let's make our classrooms discussion rich, even if our students are not necessarily passing physical papers around. Let's bring that student voice back in the classroom so that we can make sure that we really are looking at what students know and what they're able to do in mathematics. So thank you again for engaging with me in this presentation. If you want some additional information just to unpack those 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, don't forget to go to our Canvas course. Also, there's an accompanied set of resources that will be with this particular video. And so please take advantage of those as well. I'll have a list of additional resources you can use to learn more about each of these things. And as I said again, don't hesitate to call me to come and be your partner so we can work together to implement these protocols in your classroom. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.